Cohen is the co-founder, president, and chief operating officer at Humatics Corporation. Based in Cambridge, Humatics Corporation builds ultra-precise micro-location sensors and analytic software intended to transform how people and machines locate, navigate, and collaborate in an increasingly connected world. Elizabeth Olek is the senior medical director at Puma Biotechnology in South San Francisco, California. Prior to joining Puma, she held senior positions at pharmaceutical companies such as Achillean and Novartis, in which she was responsible for clinical research and the advancement of drug candidates for the treatment of infectious disease. Phil Reilly is a partner at Third Rock Ventures in Boston. He specializes in starting companies to develop breakthrough therapies for genetic disorders. Prior to joining Third Rock, he was CEO and chairman of the board for Interleukin Genetics, as well as the executive director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center for Mental Retardation. Mylea Charvat is the CEO and founder of Savonix, where she drives strategy to address dementia globally and works as a domain expert in digital cognitive assessment. She's committed to advancing the integration of cognitive health data into mainstream health and wellness. Christine Lemke is the co-founder and president of Evidation Health, which focuses on turning everyday behavior data from sensors, devices, speech, video, and other sources into new knowledge about health and disease. Previously, she was the co-founder of Sense Networks, which developed the first machine learning platform for mobile phone activity data. And Travis McCready is the president and CEO of the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, which is a $1 billion public-private partnership with the mission of advancing the life sciences ecosystem in Massachusetts. He directs and oversees the center's investment strategy, including the agency's operation, programs, and partnerships. So thank you so much all for joining us. I thought we could start things off. If you could maybe each take 5 minutes and describe, from your different perspectives and backgrounds, what do you see as maybe some of the key opportunities or challenges in terms of partnering with academic public health? And I'm going to take a seat to listen, and then I'll come back up to guide discussion after you've had a chance to share your thoughts.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So I came to the School of Public Health here in 2003 from the health industry. At the time, I was responsible for bioethics programming for a large pharmaceutical company across the river here. And I wanted to do that work with credibility and integrity. I had a CEO who wasn't interested in bioethics work as marketing. And so I knew I needed more education. There was no better place to get that than here at the School of Public Health. And yet, I had a lot of trepidation. I was quite concerned. Most of my friends are not traditional corporatists. I had spent enough time living in this neighborhood and going to cocktail parties with people would ask me, what do you do for a living? And I'd say, I run an ethics program for a pharmaceutical company. And then, they flee. And that's the end of the fun. And so I was worried about coming here to the School of Public Health, perhaps more so than medical schools. I think schools of public health are still working through how they reconcile the mission to certain truths about industrial life. And so I came over to interview with George Annis, who's here, and Michael Groden. And I confessed that I was worried that I would be unwelcome here. And George, gave me some great advice. He said, it's all about making good arguments. You remember that, George? You said it's all about making good arguments. Doesn't matter where you've come from. Doesn't matter whether there's money behind who you are. It's still about making good arguments. And I wish I could share that advice, package it up, and distribute it to schools of public health or to industry. I suppose that's what we're doing right now, in a way. I'd actually like to give that to the Democrats and the Republicans who could use it, or to the rest of tribal America right now. It's all about making good arguments. I worry that schools of public health in particular ossify a bit to the relationship with industry in ways that make it harder to educate students with an entrepreneurial mindset are around innovation. And, you know, the ecosystem across the river here in Kendall Square is all about, you know, fast-paced innovation and design thinking and approaches to doing really crazy, audacious, transformative things that I didn't always see, candidly, here at the School of Public Health, although the commitment and the compassion were gorgeous and admirable. And yet, it's different than the kind of MIT hacker environment that I'm accustomed to. And it would be a shame if we couldn't reconcile these world and cultural views. And so, in some respects, I felt like I was my own private embodiment of a private sector collaboration with academic public health, and it worked, and I'm delighted to be back here a decade and a half later. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Olek, and what I heard this morning that really resonated with me is that context matters. So just a word about being a clinician and a physician by training who went into industry. I trained as an infectious disease physician, and I've most recently been involved in oncology research. What we do is try to make the lives of women with breast cancer improved. So we try to do that by helping them live longer and treating them. So one of the things I do is collaborate with academics often. And what I'm here to tell you is that we have incredibly productive, successful, and meaningful collaborations. And I think part of that is finding that common ground. So it's making the argument that we have work to do together. It's defining the goals and managing that in a way that it meets everyone's needs. I think the academics we work with find it incredibly important that they can publish. I think it plays out in what we are able to do with publishing posters, conferences that talk about the outcomes from our research. And we gain because we're a small company. I work in biotech that we're about a 30-person group. We have certain resources, but we don't have everything we need. So we work very productively with big academic centers, smaller clinicians who want to do research, as well as other companies that have resources and interests that come to bear across our common ground. So with that, I would be very encouraging about fostering relationships between small businesses, small academic centers, as well as the big.
So far, I've gained 4 minutes from these two. So I'll speak a little longer. My name's Phil Reilly. I'm very pleased to be part of the School of Public Health as a friend and advisor, and to be here with you today. I was really struck by that slide called The Island of Academia. I've had that image in my mind before, but in my view, the island is a little closer to sort of North Carolina. There are more trees. It's a more healthy looking island. But I'd like to start on a note of optimism. In the span of my professional life, say 40 years, I would argue that the gap between academia and industry has never been smaller. Just as an example, and of course these are anecdotes, in the work that I do, starting companies to address health problems, the ratio of contacts from academe to me is far higher than me to academe, probably on the order of 10 to 1. And I think it's because of the incredible innovation and intellectual curiosity that exists within academe, and people want to see it translated. I'd also say, and I'm certainly not in an industrial world like that of the cigarette makers or the alcohol producers. I'm in a more innovative startup kind of world. I would say that the most important currency where I work is the opinion that academics have of us. If we were to overnight at Third Rock Ventures lose the good reputation that we have for the most part in academe, it would have a tremendously negative effect, perhaps a fatal effect on our business. For any given company started at Third Rock Ventures, and other venture firms would be similar, there's probably 5 academic founders and another 5 to 10 key players who are in academia. Multiplied by 50 companies, which is what we started, and that's nearly 1,000 academics who are working with us in some way or another, perhaps conflicted, perhaps not. A couple of caveats. I was given a very specific assignment in terms of 2 questions to address, and I'm going to try to address them. The first question was a question about how can private sector collaborations improve the health of the public. Well, to answer that, I have to have a boundary definition of public health. Gun violence, yes. Smoking, yes. But what is beyond the perimeter of public health? It would seem to me that if something improves the life of even one person, and that helps his or her family, and that helps in some way the community, that's public health too. So to me, public health is all-encompassing. Perhaps that's Pollyannish. The other thing, and I don't want to seem cynical about this, all this discussion about academic private collaborations comes down to questions about transfer of assets, or money, as you might put it. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, the question was, how can private sector academic collaborations improve the health of the public? Well, you have to take, it seems to me, an ecosystem approach to this. If, for example, work between an academic institution, such as the BU School of Public Health, and one of the companies I'm involved with, leads to a transfer of assets in an ethical manner to the school, that helps the public health because it enriches the school itself in some small way. Let me just give you a couple of examples that all this is public domain. I was involved in founding a company, now public, called Voyager. It's a gene therapy company for central nervous system diseases. That may seem very exotic to you, but actually our main effort is to develop a new cure for advanced Parkinson's disease. Probably 500,000 Americans suffering from that today. To me, the neurodegeneration is a huge public health problem, maybe second only to food, actually. That university, University of Massachusetts Medical School, gained in many ways, including equity participation in the company, funding an annual lecture, which I, and I'm not taking any credit, which I offered to them. They didn't ask for it. So it wouldn't be great if we funded an annual meeting like this every year to foster collaborations. And they were definitely enriched by it. I'm just stepped back from being on the board of overseers of Weill and Cornell Medical School. We have an internal program there that reaches out to academics just within the medical school and offers to fund them in the order of $500,000 a year to develop new ideas that might lead to biotech innovation. And that money comes from outside of the medical school. Most importantly, though, in an era when NIH funding is, I guess it's always difficult to get, but ever difficult to get, and federal indirect rates are not going up, the possibility of getting arm's length sponsored research agreements between academe and industry has never been better. We, and I'm speaking collectively for all these companies at Third Rock, we constantly are funding, really constantly funding sponsored research agreements with indirect on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars to investigators to generate new knowledge which they can publish about. We don't withhold or try to, alter publication decisions in any way. We even think that it should be shared with everybody else because it's moving a field forward, and we're not afraid to play competitively in that field, whatever it might be. And that money is there. Now, I want to close this half of my comments. I only have 20 minutes more, so don't worry. I think there is one area that's an amazing opportunity for schools of public health. And Sandra and I have talked about this. The mantra today in biotech, which is probably the fastest growing industry in America, is big data. Big data. If I had 20 minutes, I'd tell you about all the fascinating things I've been privileged to be part of, such as doing whole genome sequencing on 8,000 people with kidney disease and marrying it to the electronic medical record to do all new sorts of data mining about this curious problem. We don't understand at all, really, what causes chronic kidney disease. We just have a first-level appreciation. And where are the good people in big data? There are many places, but certainly in epidemiology and bioinformatics, there are many opportunities that academia has not yet jumped on to do this. Okay, second part of my talk is much shorter. What are the traps? That was the question that was put to me. What are the traps that should be avoided to maximize synergies between schools of public health and, say, my world, biotechnology? And I'm not criticizing any particular group here, but I'm calling on my own experience. If I'm now standing in the shoes of the academics here, the first thing I want to make sure is that I have a sophisticated and competent technology transfer office. I can assure you, as having probably visited 20 or 30 of them around the country, they vary tremendously in quality and commitment. I have seen tech transfer offices give away gems for almost nothing, and I've seen them turn down great offers because they overvalue something. So make sure you know your tech transfer office. That would be one, and that it's appropriately sized. And do not early on overestimate, this would be my second trap to get into, do not early on overestimate the speed with which decisions can be made, just as you have to wait 9 months for an R01 grant application to be decided upon. Sometimes it takes a very long time for a young company in particular to reach a decision among many competing opportunities about who and to work with and why to work. That's part of the process of these new companies. If I'm going to be involved in reaching out to academe, I want to ask you to think about it as a marathon, not a sprint, in developing long-term relationships, not just with a company, but with an industry. And I'll just close by saying that BU School of Public Health and others in the Northeast and in California have a golden opportunity right nearby them. There are, as was alluded to by Gary, hundreds of biotech companies that I can think of in Massachusetts that might benefit from your services. So don't be afraid to follow up with me. Thank you.
I'm going to continue the thread of optimism. I started my career, I studied psychology, undergraduate pre-med, because I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to do something with the brain, but I wasn't sure, MD, PhD, what was I going to do? So I went into management consulting, which led to being an early employee at Travelocity. What was Preview Travel, was before it was called Travelocity in the 90s, and I stayed there through the IPO, and then I went back to school and became a neuropsychologist, a neuroscientist. I was in academia for a long time, and I was a clinician with a business skill set, so I found myself awash in job offers, because apparently that's a very rare thing. But I decided to start a company instead. And so now I find myself the CEO of a digital health company that's a multinational with offices in Japan and Singapore and here in the United States. And it's been an interesting journey, but I want to really echo some of the things that Dr. Pagotto put into one of her slides earlier, which I think one of the biggest opportunities, and this has been touched on a little bit here, is the opportunity to share data. We're actually pretty open source about our data. We don't put it out in the public, but we have data sharing agreements with universities as broad as the University of Tokyo, the National University of Singapore, Huashan Hospital in Shanghai, Peking Union Medical College in Beijing, and Boston University here, as well as University of San Francisco in my hometown of San Francisco. And we are giving them access to data that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. We have a very large functional neuroimaging sample, for instance, with digital cognitive assessment data that also includes blood work, fitness tracking data from their Apple Watches, and genetics data. And that sample size is over 800 people. Where can you find a neuroimaging sample size with all of that data that large? It's a real-world data set. And we've got also the entire claims and EMR records of those patients. And so we have academics that are working on that data right now. And I think it's those kinds of partnerships that can be really meaningful. I also mentor students. So we have interns that come into, they're largely health informatics and public health students, graduate students that spend a year working for part-time for our company. They work every day with engineers, with neuropsychologists that are on our team, with data scientists, learning how to apply what they're learning in their graduate studies in industry. And I think that's It's a really good synergy for that kind of work together, and it's a really great opportunity for the students. I also love it because I still get to teach a little bit, and I kind of miss that piece of being an academic. To continue that thread, I think one of the other places is the research funding that's been brought up before. At Savonix, we do fund research. We also fund graduate students. So we're getting ready to fund a postdoctoral fellow, for instance, this next year, to specifically work on some public health projects in dementia that we're very interested in. It's not research on our product. It's literally being done by my company to move the field forward, because we believe by moving the field forward, it's good for our business, given what we do. And so I think there's a lot of things you can think about contextually for really good funding partnerships that might be about research, but might also be about giving your students some unrestricted money to do some of the work that they intend to do in their graduate studies. And then the other thing that hasn't been touched on a lot is the opportunity to be key opinion leaders in your sectors. The public is very poor consumers of science. I'm in a space, a cognitive assessment, where there's a lot of junk. I mean, lumosity is notorious. I get asked all the time how we're different by venture capitalists who don't understand that the methods section of a paper is the most critical section. They are looking at the results going, look at this data. And I'm like, yeah, but look at the methods. Ugh. And they don't know that. And so there's an opportunity, I also think, for academics to be very good advisors to venture firms when they're looking at companies like mine. And in fact, I love investors like that, because when they put me in the room with a PhD who knows how to talk my language, I'm like, okay, this is going to be easy. And I've had insurance customers. We work with life insurers and health insurers in Asia that have done the same thing, and it's really deepened and strengthened many of those relationships. In fact, some of the academic partnerships we have come out of those introductions through customers. I think those are just a lot of really good examples of where the synergies can come together. And you guys are smart. I know, I was in academia for long. There's a lot of big brains in this room. You can figure out who's ethical and who's not. Ask the right questions, get to know people, and choose good partners.
I guess I should talk about all the negatives, since everybody's so damn positive. I'm Christine. I'm an entrepreneur. I've never worked in academia, but have worked with and partnered with academics my entire career. And previously, I was working in computer science and partnering with quite a few academics in computer science. And now I've rolled over into the healthcare sector, and we partner quite a lot with different academic medical institutions on some of the measures we're developing to measure health in everyday life. And in order to measure health in everyday life, we have to find folks who know the methods really well and have the credibility in the industry to make sure we're validating these things and generating the right evidence to make them true tools that measure health accurately, so that physicians will use them eventually. But what I've noticed in contrast between computer science and in healthcare now is in computer science, there's more of a bleed over between academic world and private companies. And of course, there are some brilliant examples like Google, where that technology was developed in Stanford. MIT is replete with stories of things that have been developed at MIT and then rolled into companies. Akamai comes to mind as one of the first large internet companies. Those examples might exist in biotech. They might exist in the molecular world. They don't exist in public health. Like I just haven't seen a lot of it in public health. But as we get to a world where many of the interventions exist, but we don't know who to target them at what time. We don't know what non-biological tools to provide people, interventions to provide people at specific times. Things like epidemiology make a big difference in whether these interventions can be deployed safely, cost-effectively, and at scale. And what I haven't seen is a readiness and willingness on the part of a lot of different schools to partner with us in that direction, building new companies, spinning out their technologies, sharing their data more readily, bidirectionally, not just from private companies to public sector, but public sector back to private sector. Just a lot of sort of skepticism around that, a lot of reticence around that I can't necessarily explain because I don't have the deep background, but I can tell you that reticence does not exist in other areas. In computer science, literally you'll find a professor of computer science who has founded 20 companies and still holds their academic position, still holds their lab, does work on behalf of, private sector. It's just the lines are so blurred between the two, and it's created extraordinary commercial value in the world. There's a question mark of how much other types of value it's created in the world, but an extraordinary amount of commercial value by that bleeding between the two. Healthcare is different. There's a whole side of healthcare that's a double-edged sword. You could really harm people if you're not ethical in the way that you share data across these two worlds and share expertise across these two worlds. But I've seen just a huge amount of reticence, a huge amount of skepticism, and also we speak really different languages. It feels like in academics, you guys are really amazing at coming up with questions. In the private sector, if we don't decide and move, we die. And so we don't have time to ask all the questions that often need to be asked. And yes, sometimes that ends up in disaster, and sometimes it ends up in good, but it's sort of a world where if you're not moving, you're dying. And so bridging that context or bridging those two things I found to be an enormous challenge. And so very open to this discussion and figuring out ways to bridge some of those things a little bit more seamlessly.
I hesitate to say that they saved the best for last. No. I also hesitate to say that I guess I represent the diversity on the panel. I'm the only lawyer. That's what I meant. That's what I meant by that. This is not being taped, is it? So my organization is a public-private partnership. We have about $1 billion to $1.5 billion of funding that is largely a mixture of mostly taxpayer dollars, but some other private capital as well. And we use that to invest in the life sciences ecosystem here in Massachusetts through a combination of tax incentives, grant funding for infrastructure, lab facilities, incubators, ultra high-end pieces of equipment like cryo-EMs, fMRIs, and the like. We run the largest life sciences internship program in the United States of America. We fund somewhere order of magnitude 550 to 600 college internships and 100 to 150 high school internships a year. And we also have risk capital that we deploy, and we've chosen to focus on the pre-seed stage. So venture does a great job at more maturing companies, but there is a dearth of pre-seed stage funding out there for investigators and early ideas, and so that's the lane in which we play in. We like to say we get things venture ready and angel ready, so that folks like Third Rock can step in and carry the ball from there. My perspective on this is in terms of academic industry collaborations is pretty simple. Massachusetts is recognized as the leader in the life sciences industry globally, and there are a lot of reasons why. But the primary reason is because the distance between academia and industry is the shortest anywhere in the world. There is great porosity between institutes of higher education, academic medical centers, and industry. Typically speaking, you can go anywhere else in the world and you will find friction or some barriers, some hard and some soft, between the academy and industry. But here in Massachusetts, for a lot of reasons we don't have time to go into, there is a great deal of collaboration between the academy and industry in the areas of biotech, pharma, medical device, diagnostics, and digital health / bioinformatics. The reason I think is, and the way we think about it is, there's a difference between outcomes and outputs, and we always need to be mindful of that. The academy tends to orienteer towards the outputs of policy and papers. You write papers, you write papers, and you write more papers, and you go focus on policy. Industry tends to be focused on the output of a product. and being on this path of translation towards creating a product. And in Massachusetts, we have a great way of thinking about the overall outcome of being health. So if you can get those two outputs aligned, you get your papers and policies on a path towards being a translatable product, a commercialized product, then you're going to remove a lot of the emotional baggage associated between industry and academia. I think that one of the greatest areas in which we see this happening and accelerating is obviously in the areas of big data. A cautionary tale to the academy. Yes, having more data and offering up your data to the industry can be a boon. Sure, if, and I think this is the caveat, if you have your understanding that ultimately what industry wants with that data is to be able to commercialize a product, develop a commercializable product. They're not just after this for a policy or a paper. If you understand that, and if the academy understands that going in, whether it's big data or long-term longitudinal studies like the Nurses' Health Study or whatever it actually is, I think we can address some of these emotional concerns about whether or not a particular relationship is going to take advantage of the other in a particular relationship. The one thing I'm really curious to talk about is, and the previous panel got into this a little bit, is this notion of behavioral change. Because I do feel like when I'm dealing with the academy, and particularly outside of Massachusetts, this question of behavioral change comes up a whole heck of a lot. In terms of schools of public health and how do they think about producing a policy that is actually bought by the public in terms of driving greater health. I don't know how we get more schools of public health to think in terms of not just being Dr. No, right? Saying you can't do this, you can't do that, don't eat this, don't eat that, and thinking more in terms of Dr. How. How do you actually accomplish something? Because nobody wants to deal with an institution that's constantly telling you no. I think the private sector does an excellent job. And I appreciate the way the private sector has developed a way of getting people to buy something. And I think we have a lot to learn in the School of Public Health institution from the industry in that capacity.
Thanks so much for starting us off with those perspectives. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. And while we're getting the microphones ready, I'll start with just the first question, which is, on Academic Island here, if we want to think strategically about how we can do a better job trying to form some of these partnerships, can you look to some of your experiences in maybe cases where partnerships with academia have worked well? What are some of the key reasons those have worked well? Or maybe if we can learn from experiences that did not work so well, what were some of the reasons they didn't work? Whoever wants to chime in.
I can do a quick start because we've had both successes and massive failures in partnering with academia. Most institutions don't have, in technology, we call it an API, an application programming interface, which is just a standard way and a menu of items that we can ask you for and reliably receive something. And every institution is really different. Related to your idea about all the tech transfer offices are really different. Some know what they're doing and some don't know what they're doing. For these types of institutions, I don't even think most of you know how to add value to companies. And then further to that, there's no one dedicated to help with that transaction. And so what you end up doing is dealing with professors individually, and that's a mess. That is a holy mess. There's no standard policies, there's no standard terms, there's no way to ethically figure out what makes sense from an institution perspective. Your value is trust. your value is public trust, and if you abuse that public trust or form the wrong partnerships, that's a huge, like, a terrible thing for everyone, I think. But without guidelines and some process for figuring out what are the right trustworthy relationships, I think it's just a waste of time often. Sorry to be harsh.
Yeah, I'd jump in on that. I mean, that's, you nailed it. I mean, we funded a $5 million project. I don't think they mind me telling you this, but we funded a $5 million project at the Harvard School of Public Health to build a microbiome facility. It's going to be one of the largest facilities that has characterized samples of microbiota from fecal samples that are taken from folks that are participating in the Nurses' Health Study. It's a great public health resource, which we refused to fund at first because there was no sense of understanding how to bring it to industry, how to have relationships with industry. Who in the industry would you even have a relationship with? Are you willing to be able to share data that is ultimately can lead to IP, right? This whole notion of bugs as drugs. Can you share microbiota from this massive library that can be then can then lead to IP, because that's what industry at the end of the day wants. And this entire coaching process of understanding what industry wants, who in this industry you need to deal with, and who should be the single throat to choke. And it's not the professor. Who should be the single throat to choke on behalf of the School of Public Health has been an interesting process.
Ditto. Yeah, and I'm going to go negative for you because I was very positive earlier, but we're in the middle of what I would call is like a negotiation from hell right now with a university, because they looked at our agreement they want to use our software in research, and we're not charging them for it. We're letting them have it for free because we do a lot of that because we want it to be used. We want to help them build digital platforms. What was interesting about it was they looked at how we collect data from our users, and they're like, well, we have to own the data. Well, no, we're a commercial company. The data we own, the data we collect on our device is owned by us. But then they really started going into this whole thing about but you're going to maybe create a product, or create new products from the data. Right, exactly. And they got very upset by this. And I'm like, but I'm not a charitable. I actually had to say to their dean, I'm not a charitable institution. I mean, I am giving you a product for free that's worth about $60,000 a year based on what you're doing with it. And in return, what I'm getting back is actually all of the data that we're collecting. And I'm not going to sell that data. I'm not selling, I'm not 23andMe. I'm not selling your DNA. But I am taking that data into my system. And I'm looking at it, and I'm learning from it, and I'm building innovations in my current product and new products off of what I learned from it. And that's what I exist to do as a business. And so that's been a really frustrating thing. And then I think the other thing, and Christine touched on this a little bit about speed of decision, is seeking clarity versus certainty, and this idea of being able to answer every question you have. We can't, and we don't have time to make decisions on certainty. We must seek clarity, which means often, for me as a CEO, maybe it's 53% one way, 47% another, and I've got to make a business call and move, and I don't have time to do 5 more studies. I don't. My board of directors, my venture capital backers will have a meltdown, and they didn't fund me to be a charitable institution. And so I think there are these conflicts, and I didn't talk a lot about them earlier, but they exist. I think there are partners that are easier to work with than others that understand that you can be a for-profit business that is also what I would call a triple bottom line company, that is also about doing good in the world and creating social impact and putting a product in the world that is good for people, not bad for people. And I think you can do all those things and make money. I don't think they're mutually exclusive concepts, but that can be the really frustrating piece.
Gary, if you want to chime in on this, and then we'll move on to another question. Yeah.
Those were great examples, and let me just offer perhaps a longer perspective. One of the products of the School of Public Health, of course, is the students. And this is certainly a commemoration of the 20th anniversary, as you said, Sandro, of Questrom and the School of Public Health offering an MPH MBA. And there are great courses that are more tuned to the corporate world over at the business school. There aren't a lot here at the School of Public Health, and we've had an ongoing conversation about that. And you know what? So I'm wondering if behavior change starts here actually with a different kind of educational opportunity for public health students. You know, the island analogy, Michael, is awesome, but you're sending people off the island every year out into the world. And so, you know, I did a quick survey of public health schools. University of North Carolina offering a course in public health entrepreneurship. University of Michigan, entrepreneurship and innovation in public health. Temple, fundamentals of managing a small business at the School of Public Health. Harvard, innovation and entrepreneurship in healthcare. NYU, finance for social theorists. Creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And here's my favorite at NYU. If there's anyone from NYU, come talk to me afterwards. This is great. Entrepreneurs, robber barons, salesmen, and frauds, the American business tradition. There is, and Phil talked about it in terms of big data, whether it's big data or AI or wearable health devices or some of the technologies that have been alluded to here. There's just enormous energy happening within a stone's throw of the School of Public Health. And whether it's in partnership with Questrom or here, I think there's an enormous opportunity to train and to show the corporate world that at BU students are being trained in, you know, the beautiful, proven traditional public health methodologies, but also in 21st century audacious ways of tackling problems.
Thank you. So please, questions, comments, there and here.
I have a question for Christine. So you sort of brought up the negative between academia and your world. What about with the NIH? That's public domain data. I mean, is that worse? I mean, if you make inroads there, and you should be able to, this data
Does
that's...
the N in NIH mean never? I mean, okay, so NIH.
I think that's one thing that academics and private sector will agree on.
We've gone to a different level. NIH, what a national treasure. Like, honestly, what a national treasure. They've funded, you know, just groundbreaking studies, longitudinal studies that nobody else would have ever funded. Like the genome studies that they've done, even Framingham, like right across the hall over here, exactly. So one of our collaborations with BU was actually with Framingham, so it was with the PI on the Framingham Heart Study. And sorting through how to access the data, not even for a product that we were going to commercialize, but literally creating a measurement tool for the good of society. Like, literally, the result of this project was we're open sourcing our measure, we're putting it out there for anyone to collaborate on, improve, deploy for the good of society. Because we were a private company, even though it was funded by another governmental agency, and even though we promised not to build any unique IP that our company commercialized, it was still a year before, from start to actually getting the first bit of data out of that particular study. And mostly because, and I'll admit, mostly because, you know, this is the first time NIH had really, like, we just looked weird. Like, what, you're a private company, you don't want to, like, build this thing, you don't want to profit off of it, or we don't understand. And I was like, aren't you guys government? Don't you understand? But it was hell, honestly. Like, I probably won't even ever do it again. It was that bad. Until there are some sort of API or there's some sort of rails where there's policy, where there's structure, where there's a consistent process. It was a total time suck. I hate to be so negative, but it's a national treasure, and it's just sitting there like behind a glass wall, and you can pet the glass wall, but you can't quite get at it. It's terrible.
At the when the vice president of the prestigious Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute has to turn over to the hospital $1.4 million of a windfall stake in a biotech company in light of a series of for-profit deals and industry conflicts at the cancer center, and now the Sloan Kettering is forced to rethink its corporate relationship in 2018. So I'd like to broaden the discussion and agree with Professor Caswell when she said this morning, we have to look at reforming capitalism and changing the dynamics. We have a society that's becoming more greedy. The wage differences, the salaries differences are extensive. I run a small business for 24 years. I deal with these multinational corporations all the time. Some of them are into price fixing. Some of their board members have been in jail, consolidation in this country, and I see it totally differently. I see it moving in a totally different direction, and I agree with Professor Caswell. Schools of public health have to, this should be a cautionary note to them. They have to be very careful in this collaborative relationship going forward. Thank you.
Anyone like to comment?
I'll do that, just because I'm a CEO of a multinational corporation. But we are a triple bottom line business. And I think for me, when I started this, I'm not ashamed that I started a company to make money. I'm not ashamed of that, because the money that I make employs people. And it provides health benefits for them, and it provides for their families. I do think you can build a company that's ethical. I think there are really good examples out there. I'm going to call out a couple. Patagonia comes to mind. Costco comes to mind. If you look at their corporate practices, if you look at the way they treat their employees, if you look at a lot of things, there are companies that are making money that are also doing the right thing. And you can do both. I think, it's how much money you make, and that's where the greed comes in. How much is enough? And, and I look at some companies, I'm like insurance companies, for instance, who are beholden to shareholders, not to the people that they cover for their health. And how much profit is enough profit for your shareholders, and at what expense? And I do think, I think what's really unique, and I wrote an article about this in TechCrunch that was very well received, is when you look at digital health companies, look for a clinician on the founding team or in the C-suite. Because if you've got somebody that took an oath, if you've got somebody that is introducing medical ethics into business decision making, I think you're going to have a very different kind of company. I mean, I've got 4 clinical neuropsychologists on my executive team, and I can tell you when we're making business decisions, the number one thing is it clinically valid? And is it solving the problem that we set out to solve? And we could make money faster doing certain things, but we're actually going to stick with a clinically valid product that's solving the problem we set out to solve, and it takes a little bit longer to get there. We also chose venture capitalists who would back that kind of company, and that's a different conversation as well. Who do you take money from? Who are your shareholders, right? Especially if you're a privately held company. Who sits on the board? How are they making decisions for this company? And when you're looking at a company to work with, ask to talk to the board members. I've had academics ask to talk to my board members, and I've made them readily available for conversations. And I just think you can look for transparency, and you can look for how are decisions being made at this business, and you can ask a company you want to work with, are you a single bottom line business? Are you a double bottom line business? Are you a triple bottom line business? How do you operate? How do decisions get made?
So I'm glad you raised the Sloan Kettering matter. I thought a lot about that before coming here. I'd first point out that it was a failure within academia, not within industry. That would be my first point. I'd also say we exist in a very large society with thousands of different players, and in general, disclosure rules within publicly traded companies, where there's many abuses, I don't deny that at all, are far more rigorous than within academia in many ways. If you are an officer of a publicly traded company and you get stopped for drunk driving, even though it's totally unrelated to the work you do, that's a disclosable event and can cost you your job. So I think what Sloan Kettering points out, in full disclosure, I know some of the people personally there about this, I think it shows a process failure, for sure, in a very important institution. But it's in sharp contrast to, for example, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, where it's exceedingly difficult for investigators of the highest quality to share their intellectual wealth with others because of rules to avoid conflict of interest. And to come back just for a moment to the NIH point, we have many meanings to the acronym NIH, such as not invented here. But that's really, although a little bit funny, that's also very sad, because what it means is the situation is, the institution is set up so it's exceedingly difficult for the great people at NIH to share their knowledge with the private sector. In fact, I usually work with people at NIH after they've left it, which I'm very sorry about also. I don't want to belittle it in any way. I do think it's a national treasure, as one of you said, but to think that there's probably thousands of great ideas that could be translated into new companies, great jobs, help human health that isn't going anywhere there, it troubles me greatly.
Travis, did you want to weigh in?
If only I could take my life sciences center hat off for a second and emote with you. I mean, I think you're spot on. I think that we have massive ethical and moral issues that are getting more complicated, not easier, within the private sector, and I struggle personally and professionally with that on a lot of different levels. And ultimately, what allows me to sleep at night is I ask myself a very simple question, which is, in these situations where you have a capacity and an opportunity to affect change on the front end, do you want to engage in a relationship with industry, with the private sector that would allow you to affect change? Or do you want to be the kind of organization or the type of individual that is trying to correct bad behavior, right? I mean, those, I'm not to be reductionist about it. Before I entered into philanthropy, a friend of mine sat me down and said, look, there are two types of nonprofit organizations. There's a nonprofit organization that approaches the banks of the river and sees children drowning, and the nonprofit organization will organize and mobilize to throw those children life preservers. And they'll raise more money and have more partnerships to save the kids that are drowning in that river. And then there's a second type of nonprofit organization that will approach that same bank and ask, where are the children coming from? How did they get in the water? How come every time I throw a life preserver and save one kid, two more appear? Where? And try and solve the problem at a different level and affect change, right? Both are doing the right thing, right? There's no right answer here. The question is, what type of organization, what type of individual are you? Are you going to try and address the issue that's in front of you and try and correct a wrong that's in front of you, or do you want to try and affect the problem from upstream? And I think for me, this question for schools of public health, they stand at a crucible moment. They stand at a crossroads. Do you want to affect change? And sometimes the most effective way of affecting change is having a collaboration with industry. Yes, you have to do all your due diligence. You have to watch out for all these ethical and moral pitfalls. But by definition, a relationship with industry is not wrong. And I do feel that sometimes schools of public health take a very binary view of that question, that a relationship with industry, wrong, purism and staying on the island, right. And I think actually the world's a lot more nuanced than that.
Thank you. Additional comments, questions? Oh, many. Yeah.
First of all, this has been a fabulous day, Mike. So thank you very much, and for Boston University for organizing this. And a lot of things are swirling in my mind, but I'm thinking about the macro level. Like, what are we losing because we're fighting about how to best partner in terms of new knowledge that could be of broader public benefit? And I think that this conversation has given me a lot of thought, from very basic sharing of workforce development, student courses, preparedness of our tech transfer offices and everything else, all the way up to really unique relationships that could be had. But I do think we need to maybe have another conference to add in the government, and even though we just mentioned NIH, but we talk about governments. When I look at the portfolio that we have in our School of Public Health, we have federal dollars, we've got state dollars, we have foundation dollars, we have monies from a variety of places, including some from private industry through the Maryland Industrial Partnerships and those that are negotiated. But I think the discussion about what knowledge is needed, what the public needs in order to move health forward, it would be useful to get the foundations and the government with you all. But each of you have just brought, and the case study approach has been terrific, so thank you very much.
Thank you. I think over here.
Hi, I have a question for the women on the panel. I think, as we probably all know, business and academia tend to be male-dominated. So I'm wondering if you all can cite an example, or if you have any ideas of what a powerful, meaningful partnership means for women's empowerment, and what you all are doing to intentionally, purposefully create more space for women in both spheres.
Okay, I'm going to tackle this because I mentor a lot of young women. I have a lot of young women coming onto my staff, both interns, people right out of MBA, people right out of MD, PhD. I'm part of All Raise. If you don't know what that is in Silicon Valley, please check it out. It's an incredible organization of women VCs and entrepreneurs that are dedicated to ending the bro culture in Silicon Valley. As to what I've encountered, I'll be very frank. Yeah, it's the most common question I get asked by venture capitalists when I pitch my company, bar none, is what does your husband think of what you do? Yeah, I have to breathe deeply. So I used to just, answer the question. He's really supportive. It's a team sport. We discussed it before we started the company. The last time I got asked that question, I just turned around and said, what does your wife think of what you do? Yeah, because I was like, I'm sick of this question. This question is offensive. It's offensive. And I don't think, to the guy's credit, he turned bright red. And I think he was like, oh, God, I just did that horrible thing that they're writing about in U.S. News, and World Report. And you could see him just kind of hanging his head. And his assistant, who was a woman, was just looking at him like, you idiot. And he did apologize. He said, I don't think that came off right. I said, no, it didn't. But the point is, you wouldn't ask a man what his wife thinks of what he does if he'd started a company. And I mean, I get it all the time, especially now that we're a multinational, and I may have to relocate my family to Asia for a period of time for my business. Will your husband relocate with you? All these questions about my family. I'm like, can we talk about the P&L? Can we talk about the revenue we're going to do next year? Can we talk about the LOI we just signed for a 5-year, 7-country deal with a very large insurance company, for God's sake? And not talk about my family. So you're hearing the passion in my voice? Yes, it happens all the time. But I think what's different for me, and I'm 45, so I've been in business a long time and in Silicon Valley since the 90s, and it got worse, but I think it's flipping now, because I do find that women like myself, instead of just kind of sitting there quietly and answering that question politely, are now turning it on its head and saying, you know what, that's off limits. And I'm a qualified professional with a really good with a really good education and pedigree, and I'm qualified to run a company. If you look at my bookings to my capital raised, I'm the most capital efficient company in my sector on comps, which I'm very proud of. And I think my business can stand on its own on its numbers, and we should be talking about that.
Liz or Christine, would you like to weigh in?
I just married a woman, so I don't get that question.
Deeply unfair.
Problem solved. I don't get, any of that. But to be practical, the things that I hope I'm doing is being a good example. So being successful and winning and doing all these things to drive my organization forward in the shape that I'd like it to be. An ethical organization is one thing. A second thing is 4 out of 6 of our board members are women. Half of our team is women, and so creating opportunities, and then asking really good men for help, like constantly. And we should never be shy of that. It's not just the women you should ask for help, but it's the great men around you that you should ask for help to.
Yeah, and I'd add, build a good team, and give women opportunities on your team. And that's been really key in the group I'm in.
And set an example for how you conduct meetings, when for like the mansplaining or the talking over, and notice it. Like I notice it in my team. My team's also about 52% female. My president for Asia is a woman. My COO is a woman, 2 women on the board, but it's a very diverse team. I am very proud also that I just found out from our Series A investors when we did their portfolio reviews annually that my company is the most racially, sexual orientation, and gender diverse company in their portfolios. Every single one of them. And that was, I felt like a real moment to talk about what we've accomplished culturally. And so just to focus on those things and focus on hiring a really highly qualified team and mentoring the heck out of them and developing them and giving them opportunity.
So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Craig?
Hi, Craig Ross here at the BU School of Public Health. I love the analogy about the babies in the water and throwing a life preserver. And sometimes I feel that when companies are in the healthcare sector, they're very focused on treatment. You know, medical devices that will improve this particular orthopedic problem, or you know, certain protocols for treating different cancers or whatever it might be. And us in public health are tending to look upstream, like what are the systems and what's the population influences that are creating these cases of disease that companies are coming in and trying to solve. So there tends to be this time disparity between public health solutions to things, which may be focused around prevention, and profitable opportunities to treat. So I just wanted, if you could weigh in a little bit on your thoughts about how companies would think about approaching problems and the time horizon aspect of that.
I mean, Dean Mylea and I have had a couple of deep conversations about this. I mean, one of the ways, in my opinion, that you approach the time horizon question is by trying to figure out a way to monetize prevention. I mean, prevention is, let's face it, prevention is not sexy. Telling people not to do something, or do exercise more, or do all the things that we know lead to greater population health. If we can figure out a way, and I think digital health is really on the cusp of doing this, and which is why I really think there's a ton of opportunity for schools of public health to marry their overall vision and goals with the digital health community. I think you can approach that time question by having access to larger, more correlated and actionable sets of data that you can then use to drive behavioral change. I think that's where at least I'm focused and we're focused.
Our company is screening, and it's focused on screening and prevention. So we're really focused on this, in particular, cognitive decline and dementia. And it was what Dean Mylea and I actually reconnected with around recently, because I had known him when I was in graduate school. It was a long time ago, and you can monetize it. We have monetized it, especially with insurance companies that operate outside the United States, where the models are different. So health insurance, for instance, in Singapore or China or Japan looks very different than it does here. Here you might turn your policy over every 2-3 years. There it's more like term life, where you buy a critical illness policy when you're 30, and it might be a 20 or 30-year policy. So that insurance company now cares very much about when you're 35, they care what your health looks like when you're 55. And so they're very monetarily invested in wellness and prevention. And what we're seeing is that, and that's one of the biggest reasons we're partnering with these companies, because I feel like the interests are so aligned around public health and digital health, and the idea of like these partnerships between industry, including insurance companies and digital health companies, and universities. And I saw that all these insurance companies have deep relationships with the schools of public health where they operate, because of the fact that they are deeply, deeply invested, and it is very important to their bottom line, we're going back to profit now, that they actually get into the business of prevention. And it's not just a nice to have for them, the way they're writing these policies, it's a must have. And so it's happening. But I think it's finding people that are where their business goals are around, also align with that mindset, and then partnering with those companies.
Anyone else like to weigh in on that? We might have time for one last question. Here.
So as we think about health disparities that are so tied with economic disparity and knowledge disparity, I'm curious how you guys think about people who might not be able to afford your product, or work for companies that can afford your product. How do you think about that consumer market that needs the help the most, and also what kinds of price point ideas you can start with? Just curious, since we're a room full of public health people, how we think about those people who are at the very bottom of the health disparity and don't have any flexible health spending money.
What I love about software is that it's actually really, really cheap to deliver. So the first person's really, really expensive because that first person that goes on my platform, the cost of them was all the R&D, all the studies that came for 3 years before that person came on. But by the time we get to the millionth person, it's pennies on the dollar. I have an incredible MD on my board, and he was just saying the beautiful thing about Savonix is it's so utterly cheap that we can deliver it for $1 a patient in rural China. And he's right. We can deliver it for $1 a patient in rural China and still make money. And we are now going to do that with B2B partnerships, working with long-term healthcare companies, working with hospitals to deploy it. We're not a B2C company yet. Maybe in the future, but it's a different business model, and I've got to crawl, walk, run. But I do think that's one of the beautiful things about software is that as long as it's clinically valid, I worry sometimes that we're going to create a class of products that are second-class products for people that can't afford to go to the doctor or can't afford more traditional solutions. And I think it's really important that we hold ourselves to a standard of clinical validity for digital health for that reason, so that as we create access, we don't actually widen the disparity gap, we narrow it. And so it's what I love about software.
Anyone have final thoughts on that? Okay. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been such an important and interesting conversation. Please join me in thanking the panel. Now I'll invite Dean Galea to wrap up.
So I was initially trained as a doctor, and I shifted to the academic world. And there are days when one wonders why one does that. But days like today, I remember exactly why I did it. It's because I actually think that there's no other social institution that is charged with having the kind of discussions that we're having today. I think we are dealing with complicated and complex issues, and it is the job of the Academy to actually convene these kind of conversations to try to grapple with them. And I think today did just that. We started with an outstanding overview of the historical issues around this topic, talked about an amazing success story around Mestican, and then had 3 really interesting case studies where you heard a divergence of opinion. And then we talked about sort of the most proximate partner to us, which is the health sector, and you heard about this afternoon. And I thought my goal for today was to end up having learned, and I feel like I'm ending the day having learned quite a bit, and I want to be, and I'm grateful to, and I want to thank all the participants for having taught me throughout the day. I want to thank all of you for being here. I already thanked the staff who made this happen, and I want to particularly thank Dean Mike McLean, who has been working on this for the past year, and I think the day really is a testament to his intellectual engagement with this issue. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for joining us.